welcome everyone to this panel. I was going to say panel, but given the way that we're situated, why don't we just call it a roundtable discussion?
Absolutely.
On what we've called the Cornerstones of Democracy. That was a project that we worked on this year in the ABA. By the way, just to start out, I guess not to be rude, being a New Yorker, I am Deborah Enix-Ross, President of the American Bar Association. And as I was beginning to think about running for ABA president, besides the people who said to me, why would you want to run for ABA president? The other question is, what do you intend to do? And it was at a time when we were seeing attacks on our democratic institutions. And my friends who were not lawyers were asking me questions largely about elections and other kind of constitutional questions. And what I realized is they were asking me rule of law questions. They weren't defining it as rule of law, but that's really what they were asking. And it was also clear that they didn't have, and these are educated people, but they didn't have a sense of what our legal structure is. In other words, what are the branches of government, what are they meant to do and not meant to do, and where's the overlap? So that began the thinking on what has become the Cornerstones of Democracy, focused on civics, civility, and collaboration. Now, when we talk about civics in the U.S. context, most of us understand that, whether we used to call it social studies when I was a student, or essentially understanding what our government does. Outside of the U.S., when I talk about this project, I substitute the words citizenship or civilization. And then people completely understand the concept. So whether we call it civics, citizenship, civilization, it has the same foundational aspects. That is, how can we make sure that our citizens, wherever they are engaged with their government in a way that is productive, that is civil, and the collaboration means that although lawyers should absolutely be leading in this area, we are not exclusively responsible for promoting and protecting the rule of law. We need to be working with journalists, with business leaders, with faith leaders, with teachers, all across the spectrum of civil society, if we're going to have the kind of confidence, that fourth C, that we would like to see. So that's the thinking behind the Cornerstones project, and what we've done is put together what I would call and believe to be a stellar group of leaders in this area. Now, I know a number of you have also said to me, you have an interest, and not only just interest, but also are involved in some of these very concepts. So that's why I think we're going to end up having this be really a discussion on what we're all doing and what our part and what our roles are and what we can continue to do. So with that, I do have formal bios for our panelists, but I've decided I'm not going to do that. Look, Jim gave me and Jim Silkenat is a past president of the ABA, and you never go wrong following Jim Silkenat's lead. So what I propose instead is we'll go around, and as I call on you, you can explain what you do and how you've come to be a part of this conversation. All right, and then I do have some questions to kind of tee up our discussion, but again, a number of you are also leaders in this area, so let's see what we get. And we'll keep talking until they come and kick us out of the room this time. So I'm going to start on my far left with Judge Adrienne Nelson.
So good afternoon. And thank you, President Deborah Enix-Ross, for giving me an opportunity to participate in the World Law Congress and talk about some of the work that we're doing in the American Bar Association. I have been active in the ABA since 2000. I am a federal judge, recently confirmed earlier this year, but I've been a judge in Oregon for over 16 years. I started off at our trial court level, and then I sat on our highest court as an Oregon Supreme Court Associate Justice, and now I'm in this new role. But I sit on today's panel as the chair of President Enix-Ross's presidential initiative, Cornerstones of Democracy Commission. As she had indicated, when she was president-elect nominee, she unveiled what was the beginning of the Cornerstones of Democracy. She called it the 3 C's. And I remember that moment when she was talking to the ABA at the nominating committee, and I sat there intrigued because it was in the winter. It was February of 2019. I was so excited about hearing what she said, and then when we fast forward a year and we found ourselves in the pandemic and racial reckoning in this country, I thought her leadership was beyond visionary. So when she wanted us to work on this Cornerstones of Democracy Commission, the ones of us who have continued to work on it have found it to be very helpful, because we have created a thought paper, and we're lucky that and fortunate that the ABA has continued us for another 2 years, where we can continue to work on doing local and regional and national projects to have people come together to dialogue around difficult topics. We have received from the American Arbitration Association, International Center for Dispute Resolution Foundation, a $200,000 grant that will be over multiple years, that we've identified up to 6, possibly 7 local, regional, and national bar associations that are going to be working on doing civilization, citizenship projects to help people come together and learn how to work together around varying viewpoints and perspectives to make sure that your governments work well. I could give many other explanations, but I know there's so many others, esteemed panelists here. I'll stop.
Yeah, and we'll come back and delve, and at any point after everyone's given their introductory remarks, if anyone has any questions or observations or comments, again, this is really meant to be a discussion. And this wasn't done by design, Judge. But I don't know, maybe judges kind of know and they like to sit together. But if I may, Bridget.
Yes, please.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, you bet. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation. I'm Bridget McCormack. I'm currently the CEO and president of the American Arbitration Association and the foundation that funded the project that you just heard about. But until December, I was the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, and I served on that court for 10 years. My work before that was in legal education primarily. And why was I invited to be part of the conversation? It's a good question. I think not only because of the foundation's funding, although that fits squarely within our priorities for what the foundation hopes to influence. One of our priorities at the AAA's foundation is to support innovative solutions to solving conflict before it becomes entrenched, and collaborating across stakeholders and communities that don't always collaborate. I assume my work as the Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court through a pandemic was also maybe why I was invited. I don't know. I'm gonna wing it here a little bit. But that was a tremendous opportunity to collaborate in ways that we don't always do. I mean, like everybody else in the world, Busy court leaders are putting out fires most of the time, and we don't take time to move upstream, collaborate across other branches of government and with other stakeholders to solve problems in ways that better serve the people who need our courts. And people who need our courts need it because things are not going well. So when we can collaborate and think about upstream solutions, we have much better results. And we were the first state in the country to stand up a statewide eviction diversion program. We stood up statewide online dispute resolution. And I have lots of other examples, but I also want to make sure everybody else has a chance to introduce themselves. So I hopefully we'll come back to some of those topics.
Absolutely. Thank you, Suzanne.
All right, I'm Suzanne Spaulding. I'm Senior Advisor for Homeland Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a national security think tank in Washington, D.C. I have the honor of being a member of the Cornerstones for Democracy Commission, and I came to this issue after a 35-plus year career in national security. Most recently as the Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for leading the men and women who protect our nation's critical infrastructure every day. And so in 2016, we were very focused on our election infrastructure. And when I got out, I was a political appointee. I got out at noon on January 20th of 2017. I did so with the understanding from our intelligence community that what we had seen in terms of information operations targeting the American population during that election was just one part of a much broader campaign by the Kremlin to undermine our democracy, use information operations and other means to undermine our democracy, primarily by weakening Americans' trust in democracy and in its institutions. And so I wound up at this think tank, Center for Strategic and International Studies, doing a deep dive on adversary attacks, information attacks on our democracy and ways we could counter that. I brought together a bipartisan group of national security experts. Then did a deep dive. I did what we call in the intelligence community, where I spent a number of years, red teaming. So try to put myself in Putin's mind. If my goal, I said to myself, is to undermine trust in democracy, where would I go next? What other institution is like elections, so dependent on the public's trust and belief in the legitimacy of the process to accept the legitimacy of the outcome? And I immediately, being trained as a lawyer, immediately thought about our justice system and how totally dependent it is in order to do what we ask it to do in a democracy on the public's trust and the legitimacy of that process. And so I hadn't heard anything about Russia going after the justice system, and I thought we were getting out ahead of something, but as we dove into it, we found lots of evidence that our adversaries are picking up on weaknesses of our own making, weaknesses that would exist even if they went away, but that they are exacerbating the decline in trust in our justice system. And we found it through lots of social media done by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, involving cases in Twin Falls, Idaho, as well as big national cases, and in their propaganda outlets, RT and Sputnik, and in official statements from Lavrov and from Putin. And we see increasingly other countries taking pages from that Kremlin playbook, China particularly, but other countries as well. And as I say, important to always come back to, they are taking advantage of our own domestic situation. But so we did a report on that called Beyond the Ballot with lots of evidence of those information operations. And we ultimately concluded among the recommendations that we have for countering, the most important thing you can do to counter the pernicious effect of that messaging is to reinvigorate civics education in our country. And so that for the last over 3 years, that has been our key focus. And I think that's why I'm here today and look forward to talking more about that.
Yes, and just to underscore that, the ABA does, as many of you know, an annual survey on civics and other areas. And in 2022, the response to this question, do you believe that there's racial bias built into the judicial system? More than 60% said yes, across categories. But amongst the startling statistics for me was that 63% of young people, that's ages 18 to 36, 63% of them said yes. Doesn't matter race, they said that. And 75% of Black respondents believe that there's bias built into the system. So when you have that kind of distrust, and we've seen in other surveys, whether it's Pew, et cetera, the distrust, the lack of confidence in our courts, and that how it's declining, the confidence in our courts, you can see we're at a critical moment, let's say. I won't say, it's hopeless, because I'm always a glass half full kind of person. But turning to courts,
Yes, sir.
see the segue, got there. Lauren.
So I'm Lauren Canfer, and I have the privilege of serving as counsel to the New York State Permanent Commission on Access to Justice, which works to promote access in the court system targeted at people who typically don't know that they have a legal problem. They may have been evicted and they have food insecurity, they have trouble paying their medical bills. So all of these problems and the ills of society have come into our state courthouses. So we know that the federal system has amazing resources and has learning labs, and they invite people to come into their courthouses to see how the court functions. We're working hard to create a parallel track in the state court system. And I think that one of the really important things is creating an understanding among young people that there are opportunities both for education and for work in the court system, and it's not closed off. So it's creating panel discussions where students in schools can see role models who look like them, who may have struggled with similar issues that they've had growing up. So it's an exciting time, and I'm also privileged to serve on this Bar Association, the New York City Bar Association Task Force on Civic Education, which was newly created this year. And through this work, I met our esteemed president because I had created a program where we actually went into an 8th grade classroom in an underserved school in, if you know New York, in the Bronx, and the children were thirsty for the knowledge, and I think that creating those types of opportunities is very significant. So that the work, while it's also providing access to the court system, it's providing access to education, it's access to information. So that's why I was invited to join.
Yes. And not just because he is a past president, that's not the only reason, which would be reason enough. But Jim, in your role with WJP, can bring us some of the statistics and understanding from a global perspective. So, Jim.
Jim Silkenat, I was president of the ABA 9 years ago. Deborah and I have decided that there should be a president from New York every 9 years, and that is our plan for the future. I've been very active in this association for 50 years now, and have chaired a number of committees and been in this room an enormous amount. As Deborah mentioned, she and I are both officers of the World Justice Project, which annually publishes a rule of law index, which covers rule of law performance by 140 countries, and talk about that a bit more as we get further into the discussion.
Thank you. And certainly not the least.
So
Absolutely, Michele, because we want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. We wanted a business perspective. We wanted to make sure that we had someone with your talent and your depth and your experience. So we're really pleased that you're here, Michele.
I did ask Deborah, are you sure you want me on this round table? So I'm Michele Coleman-Mays, and I'm General Counsel at the New York Public Library, which does sound as if it may be more on the periphery of this discussion until you understand exactly how that institution functions. And there's probably no better example of that than the immigrants that are now seeking asylum. They flock to our branches. They are befuddled, they are disappointed, they are misled as to what it takes to become a participant in this society. And what you realize is they come from countries where even the idea of a library being free is foreign to them. So several years ago, I served on the election administration under President Obama, and we looked at all the rules that govern the various states and what needed to be modernized or revised. And what I learned is it is certainly decentralized, that's an understatement, but almost by the luck of where you are born, you figure out how hard it is to vote or not, you know, where you happen to live. And it made me understand how precarious the vote can be. And going back to what Bridget said a minute ago about the rule of law, that's the basis for this profession. Yes. And if you don't believe in the rule of law or don't know where to find it, how can you become a participant? How can you instill trust in someone? And so as I look at these immigrants, and they are truly destitute, it just makes you understand that if you can get them to believe and have hope, have a glass that is half full, that they can become meaningful participants, but they have to be taught. And so when Martin Luther King said the arc of history bends toward justice, not without a push.
Thank you. And why don't we do this? Why don't we continue? So since we're an intimate group, let's go around the table and have everyone, you can introduce yourself.
I'm Ken Wasserman. I am active in the city bar on a few committees. I'm a state solo practitioner in New York. I do have a question initially for Deborah, which I'll take the opportunity to ask. To what extent might it be important to the Cornerstones of Democracy project to define democracy?
It's a great question. You know, it's like in the WJP when we tried to define the rule of law, right? Because when I talked about when my friends would say to these questions that they were asking me were fundamentally rule of law questions. What we try to do is make sure that we are what we're not doing is trying to promote one political party over another. And what we're trying to do when we talk about civics education is not wade into the specific curriculum because we know that that's also can be politicized. Early in my presidency, I had the pleasure of meeting with a number of senators, including Senator Cornyn from Texas, and I talked about this, and he said, yeah, I don't understand. I tried to introduce the idea of civics education, and it was, he was, I mean, criticized for it because people thought that it was some attempt to influence thinking of students. So it's important for us to, maybe in the definition to what we talk about, what we're not trying to do, as opposed to saying we think, especially when you go around to other countries, we're not saying to other countries, you need to be a democracy. What we're saying is that you need to have your citizens understand whatever the government, however it's structured now, and what they can do if they feel that the structure is not working. So that's kind of the way that I think we're thinking of it in the Cornerstones project. But thank you for that question. Okay.
So hi, I'm Brett Parker. I'm the executive director here at the City Bar. I've been in the role for 10 years. I had the privilege of working with Michele many, many years ago when we were both at Colgate Palmolive, and I'm so happy Lauren's here because our Civic Education Task Force is newly formed and very excited to get going. So I'm here to listen and learn, and just here as an attendee, and thanks to all of you for having this conversation.
Thanks for welcoming us to your home.
Yes.
So great
Even if it is cold.
Yeah.
You have holes in your jacket.
I've done a lot of work on education reform. I have a master's degree in history. And I have a lot of thoughts about the content of what we're trying to do based on on-the-ground work I've been involved in. Talk about that.
Sure.
I'm Alan Solomon. I am not a lawyer, although I was admitted to NYU Law School, but I chose not to go. I am a former diplomat. I was the United States Ambassador to Spain. I'm not a career foreign service officer, but Obama appointee. More relevant is the fact that I'm the Dean Emeritus, who spent 10 years as the Dean of the Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, which is one of the leading sources of research and advocacy for the political and civic engagement of young people in youth voting, but also civic education. And Suzanne, I'm familiar with the work that you've done to make civic education a national security priority. And I'm also familiar with the legislation that Senator Cornyn filed, which is not dead. It's a bipartisan piece of Deloro and Cole and Cornyn and
Coons.
Coons. It would have done something to correct the gross imbalance. I mean, I think we can stipulate to the fact that our democracy is not as strong as it at one time, and many of us believe one of the elements is the lack of civic education in our schools. We spend 54 cents per enrolled student in America on STEM education and 5 cents on civic education. And since all No Child Left Behind was enacted, the time spent on social studies instruction is now about 44%. So I refer you to the Tisch College and the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or CIRCLE, which is probably does as much research on this matter as any group in the country, and we'd love to be a source of information for those of you that are working on it at the Bar Association. There has to be a really good article. I don't know if you saw it in the Bar Association Journal. Its momentum grows for stronger civic education across states. There's a lot of work being done, but there's a lot of pushback being done. In Texas, I mean, one of the best ways of teaching young people about democracy is to give them an opportunity to do democracy and to engage in civic learning actively. The state of Texas, in its wisdom, now makes it illegal illegal for young people to be engaged in any contact with legislators as part of their education. Not to mention the whole bullshit about critical race theory and attempts to, and actually attempts to politicize the non-political teaching of civics as a way of squashing it.
Yes. We'll come back to that, but yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Marcela Celorio. I am a Mexican ambassador. I took a pause in my diplomatic career to launch a nonprofit organization that aims to promote the 2 R's, rights and responsibilities. Because along the years, for more than 30 years, providing citizen services and assistance and protecting Mexicans in the United States and some other places in the Middle East and Europe, I saw that we were missing one part of the equation. We only talk about rights, that is fantastic, but if you are an attorney, you have to take a look at the responsibilities as well. So it's rights and responsibilities, and my foundation is focusing in civic education. It's like the United States is a land of country of opportunities, but it's also a country of rules. And if you want to be successful, and if you want to achieve your full potential in this country, you have to play by the rules, but you need to know them. how come are we gonna ask a migrant to behave in a way if they don't know the rules, they don't know the culture? So we aim to teach them about the values that are underlying in the institutions and the rule of law in this country. Thank you.
So it's interesting because one of the things I was thinking about is E to the third plus cultural humility. So it's education, engagement, empowerment, and then the cultural humility part, because you have to understand where people are coming from and how can you address their concerns and needs.
But I think that's a part of collaboration.
It definitely is.
We have to acknowledge that everyone is coming from different places.
Right.
But we have to respect and acknowledge those places.
Right.
As well as figuring out where we start, then how we can come closer together and kind of develop those understandings.
Right.
I can give you an example. When I was a state court judge, we were studied about our justice system in Oregon by the MacArthur Foundation. And it was not lost on many of us in the system, but they did find that at every critical stage in the criminal justice system, people, brown and black people, were overrepresented. So I felt I was a bridge. At that time, I was one of 2 black judges in the state. The number has gone up. So percentage-wise, it looks exponential, but the numbers are still in the tens, not even 10, but it quadrupled at that point. And I went to my colleagues, my judicial colleagues, to say, we need to do more than just feel bad. We have a responsibility to show up in a way to engender public trust and confidence. And because of the relationships and my lived experience, we were able to create a listening session that continued over several months, up until the year that it ended up in a report, where we came and we heard what the experiences had been, instead of the judges and other system partners assuming what they were. And we tried to do that authentically and without feeling defensive, which was my responsibility to try and diffuse that by having conversations before we had the listening sessions to say, what are your concerns? This is a safe place. Let's talk about how we're going to show up. We're not going to sit together in a block. We're not going to do these things, just what you would think are assumptions you would make, to make sure that we show up in a certain way. And the response was very profound to everyone in the room. It was a beginning that continued and continued, that now has created different programs. And as chair of the Cornerstones of Democracy Commission for the ABA, we found many other local groups doing various things, from bar associations to working with the educators, to lawyers and judges going into classrooms. There are a lot of options for us to do it, but there's always a concept of humility that we talked about. We can't assume that we know how to build it and people will just come, because there has been misinformation. There has been this information out there to figure out where our cracks are and to make them bigger. So we have to show up in a way where maybe we have a lot of information, but we don't need to talk down or act as if we're the experts. We need to hear where people are coming from so that they can build. We can build that.
Does the commission have a concern about trying to work in Texas? Would you be banned?
Should we repeat the question?
Yeah.
For
The question was
Does the ABA commission have a concern about trying to work with the Texas bar in order to promote civic education and finding yourself banned?
So So the answer is, we have not focused on particular bar associations across the country. What we have developed is a conversation guide. We have information and resources, but I can tell you we have a broad representation of people from a variety of states where there are similar efforts being made. So it's not as if we can just come in, like I just said, and swoop in and say, well, this is what has to be done. We're providing people with information and suggestions and opportunities to do that, plus identifying places within areas that are doing that work so they can collaborate and elevate the work.
Yes.
Perhaps I could offer an outsider's perspective, maybe as somewhat of a devil's advocate, but civics, civility, and collaboration is a literary concept, but I don't know that it has to do uniquely with democracy. Can't you use civics, civility, and collaboration for pretty much any kind of a good faith governmental system that maybe wouldn't meet your definitions of democracy? So can you perhaps discuss where civics, civility, and collaboration has a link to being a cornerstone only of democracy and not of any other ideal system?
Yeah, it's not meant to say that it's exclusively just about democracy. I mean, we talk about the impact. For example, I was just in Chile, and I spent 3 days talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And very, very difficult conversations in some instances, but the same iterations apply. There's, first of all, there's the civic citizenship aspect of it. When you're talking about diversity, they are struggling with whether or not to have quotas, whether or not they were very interested in our affirmative action cases, and what the impact is and how that plays into society, civilization, what they can do to gain allies, that's the civility, and how they can work across, in this instance it was the legal profession, but also whether it's outside counsel or in-house counsel. So I think these 3 C's are universal and can be applied in very different contexts, but we started here because we did feel that it was a real threat to our society. I mean, and Suzanne, I want to come back to you for a moment. When the reason that I was particularly drawn and hoping that you would participate is because I do think it's a national security imperative, and the fact that we can't get past the divisions to be able to talk about civics education, for me, was mind-boggling. It just, it didn't seem to make any sense unless you say to yourselves, there are some people that want to weaponize this misinformation. They don't want citizens to understand what their rights are, what their responsibilities are, how to access the information, to be able to be more informed. And frankly, I think, yes, one of our goals should be to make sure that there's civics education put back into schools, but I'm concerned about the generation that has grown up without it. And again, in some of these surveys, what we've seen is that there's a lack of civility. They said 85% of people think that civility is worse than it was 10 years ago. That's not a surprise, is it really, for any of us? And when they ask what are some of the causes, the number one cause is social media, right, and then media in general, which is why I, as a journalism major, I call out the journalists and I say to them all the time, when you say Trump appointed judge, Biden appointed judge, you're underscoring that division. Now, I get it, for them, it sells papers, it's a quick and dirty, I say dirty, it's a quick way of trying to put people in categories. But this is dangerous, and the fact that, we're not able to even rally behind it for that purpose alone is something. Can you explain why we can't rally behind that as a national security imperative?
Well, I can certainly speak to why I think it is a national security threat and national security issue. And one of the reasons that I focused on adversary efforts to exacerbate this problem is to highlight. I mean, Putin chooses to engage in this activity to undermine trust in our institutions, in the rule of law and the justice system, and in democracy, not just for the heck of it, but because he understands that is a way of weakening us as a country. That is his goal. His goal is to prevent us from being able to mobilize to meet the challenges that we need to meet. And in order to do that, we have to be able to come together as a nation, right? And if you can undermine that, if you can cause chaos, I mean, again, I work very, very hard to make sure that all of the work that we do is nonpartisan. We've got to reach people all across the spectrum. But I do have to, point to January 6th as an example of a group of people who became convinced that the court's decisions in over 60 cases that ruled against, did not accept charges of wide-scale fraud in our election. Those 60 court cases were deemed illegitimate and irrelevant to those people who chose to attack the U.S. Capitol that day. Well, those who did gave them no legitimacy, and it's just a window into what happens if you erode that key pillar and those other pillars of our democracy. It makes us weaker as a nation, and I do focus very heavily on this in the context of democracy, because to me, civics, and I had to learn this. I mean, my background was all in national security, and so I've been learning from my wonderful colleagues from iCivics and Civics Renewal Network and the folks here at this table. Civics is not so much the study of our government. It is civility. It is the study of the individual's relationship with government, right? And what I keep saying, to build trust in democracy, we've got to remind people that the promise of democracy is not some myth of current perfection, doesn't exist. It is the promise of change. You have to accept that in order to be able to accept democracy, because democracy is so flawed in its implementation and so needing of reform. And the beauty of democracy is that it can change, but only if we're the informed and engaged agents of that change. And so what our adversaries are trying to do is to rob us of that informed and engaged citizenry, to convince the individuals that democracy is not just flawed and needing reform, but irrevocably broken. And the individual is helpless to bring about any change. And many, many individuals that you talk about, that generations that have been ill-served, starting, I think, with the emphasis on STEM as a national security imperative after Sputnik, that we took for granted democracy and stopped teaching it. And we now need to go back to adults. So we've launched a project called Civics at Work, which is designed to reach adults in the workplace. And we ask business leaders, and I'm happy to say Brad Smith of Microsoft was the first to sign on, we've got other CEOs, to agree to do three things: to be advocates for civics education, reinvigorating civics in our country, to engage their own workforces in ways that build civic skills like civil discourse and a sense of civic responsibility, as well as civic knowledge, and then support civics activities in their communities. And ABOTA, the American Board of Trial Attorneys, has just taken this on as an official, they are ready to sign the pledge, both as an employer and then to get all of their members to get their law firms and their clients to engage in this activity. Yep.
So, not in Austin maybe, but, certainly in their legislature. So I think one of the tools would be to take the commission in a bipartisan way and use as an example lesson plans or whatever you want to call them, materials, resources, and one could be the Federalist Papers, how to teach the Federalist Papers.
We have the conversation guide that I referenced. So we have a conversation guide that has different topics. It is not, they're not lesson plans, but they, for example, we have something for K through 12. We have things for community groups. We have ideas for law schools, because the reality of it is we need to educate people at all levels, absolutely in the schools. But as my panelists have and colleagues have already indicated, there has been a gap in education. And quite frankly, the older we get, maybe we've forgotten some of the things we've learned. And so it does bear repeating, learning that again. So we need to have the civics at work. President Enix-Ross last week was at Nationwide in Columbus, Ohio, where they have a initiative that is incredible that she can talk about. I don't think that this is an and or. I think this is a joining of all of it. And I think that it's not just one organization. I think we all need to talk about it. That's why we talk about it from not only lawyers, but judges have a role. So that's why I gave an example that I didn't just wash my hands of it, and because this is not about activism. This is about explaining how our system works and where we have those information gaps, and to help people educate. I mean, one of the greatest things that I've been able to do in my current role as a federal judge is preside over a naturalization ceremony. It was absolutely inspiring to the young lawyers who were working there. I had one of them say, I'm not sure I could pass the naturalization test, and I'm going to go back and do some study. I mean, humbling, reflective, all of those things, but also a reality. So I think that we need to make sure we get those information points out. I think it's great that we're doing surveys. I think the civil literacy survey that came out earlier this year that President Enix-Ross referenced, because they do it every year, is very telling. It lets us know where we still have work to do and where we may have achieved some success, but it also tells us that we have to continue to talk about this and put this at the forefront of everyone's mind, which is the point I think that you may have been making, among others.
So I know there's a couple of people that want to make points. I'm going to start with Jim, then go to Bridget, and then I'll come to you.
The evidence here is not just anecdotal that there are problems. International performance on rule of law issues and democracy has deteriorated in almost all countries, majority of countries anyway, over the past 5 or 6 years. This is clear from studies done by the World Justice Project, in which Deborah and I are involved, which does measures rule of law performance in 140 countries, in-person surveys, what life is like on the ground, how the rule of law works for people in real situations. And we see negative trends in all regions, all income groups of countries, and nearly all factors that we evaluated. We look at a number of different factors that compose the rule of law, and in almost all of those, there's been a decline internationally. So we're talking about a problem that is not just on our minds, but that is demonstrable, provable with statistics to back it up. And that's really what we hope will create change, provide a basis for change as we move forward.
Jim.
And I guess I want to broaden the conversation beyond the geopolitical threats that are undermining our confidence in institutions, the domestic electeds who are focused on their own self-interested futures. Those are important problems, but But there are problems beyond those, because 92% of our neighbors can't afford help with their civil justice problems. The United States ranking on access to civil justice in the World Justice Rule of Law Index is dead last. And we're dead last because most of our neighbors who have civil justice problems can't access help for those civil justice problems. And that is an unbelievable threat to the rule of law and therefore to democracy, in my view. And we're all responsible for that. We've been talking about it for generations, and we haven't done anything really about it. We maintain legal institutions that somehow are comfortable making civil justice a good that very few of our neighbors can access. It's not sustainable. And it's, in my view, it's one of the largest threats to the rule of law out there. And so Putin's at fault, self-interested electeds are at fault, but the rest of us have a role to play. If most of our neighbors believe that the rule of law doesn't account for them, they're not going to care about the rule of law either. And who could blame them?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you. I guess this was in the 2016 election. So there was a long line to vote, and I was standing there as it snaked through like 4 blocks, and this young man goes by, and there was a young woman in front of me who was clearly trying to recruit people to vote. And as he walked by, she yelled out to him, "Are you voting?" And I was struck by the cavalier remark he made. And he said, "Those people aren't going to do anything for you. You're wasting your time." And he kept sauntering down the street. And I think when you hear attitudes like that, you've got to meet people where they are. You can't just write them off. You've got to be able to engage them. And so one of the things that the library has done is called Civics at the library. And I was talking to the people who are running the program, and they have 3 pillars. They have civic knowledge, civic attitudes, civic action. They're focusing on action now, because it reminds me of a quote, "Vision without execution is hallucination," and it is. And so when you look at they just announced the award winners for the Innovation Lab. There's an Innovation Lab where they'll experiment. And most of them are focused on this last pillar, civic action. And one of the simple ones is lunch with your electeds. You know, meet them, figure out what they're doing, what do they stand for, have they met the obligations you think they should meet. But they also have book banning. So that's a big deal in the library because people believe that we should censor books. And one of the things that we've done as an institution, because it costs money, as much as people think, well, it's a book, you can get it out there any way you can. But if you look at the rural communities, many of them, that's where a lot of this is really taking hold. The books are just removed from the shelf. So what we did is we cut a deal with the publishers. We said for a limited period of time, we have these books, give us a license that's free, don't charge us, and let us circulate them. Anybody around the world can access them. Anybody in the country. And so we did that to say you can't stop the flow of knowledge. It's impossible. You may think you can, but you can't. And so at the end of the day, we're trying to teach people that democracy is a participatory sport. It is a contact sport. And if you don't believe that, then you're not buying into what it really means.
I think it's, I don't want to say the word easier. I think people have a more positive sense or more hopeful that they can get involved in the election process. The courts know. You have to be rich to do. You can't afford to resolve a dispute in a courtroom in this country unless you have a personal dispute, unless you're a well-to-do person. That's just a fact. So I think the reason why we don't give access to justice is that we don't want to.
Oh, I completely, every system is designed to get the results it gets.
Yeah.
I believe in capitalism, we love my country, but the reality is that we do use it as a tool of repression. That is what we do. We don't call it that, but that is what it is. Any other country looking at us would say, this is a way to repress working class people. And it is. So I couldn't agree with you more, that I think there's hope on the voting side. Tons of people did vote in 2020.
They did.
But I think the courts are a much tougher thing, and part of the way we have it set up to be very costly.
Well, I can tell you, I don't.
We're going to get you in.
I don't want to say that what's being said is not true, but I want us to remind ourselves that there is an opportunity for there to be civic engagement, and that's when by people sitting as jurors. And when you sit as a juror, at least in Oregon, there are videos that are used to explain the process to any prospective juror, potential juror. And then if you are then pulled out of that pool to go into individual courtrooms, the judge there can then do further education on civics. Now, I understand it's not as broad-based as we are talking about, but that is an opportunity. And I can tell you over the 17 years that I've been sitting, I have been struck by how many people that come in that are there out of obligation, but not really wanting to lean in and engage. But as you provide them with more information, shift from, well, I'm here, to, I want to actively participate, to, once I leave here, I'm going to do more. So that tells me that there are opportunities to connect and inform and educate. It's just we have to take them and also make them as big as we can.
And I know
Yeah.
that we're waiting. I
Yes.
just also want to say that the New York State court system has taken on Herculean efforts to try and open its doors. Yes, so there's dedicated money in the state budget to fund legal services providers. There's myriad legal services providers that work hand in hand with social services agencies and law enforcement. So efforts are underway, but the need continues to increase. And COVID wreaked havoc with strides that have been made.
That's
So
true.
I appreciate all of it, but there's a recognition, and it goes as if, like, technically there are plain language forms, there's translators available, interpreters available. So there's law libraries with staff with help centers that will assist people in filling out forms and guiding them through do-it-yourself programs. There are hotlines. So it's not as though I think they've closed their eyes, but there's great need and there's urgency when people are in crisis.
Yeah, and part of it is, I think, coming back to your statement, you have to know you have a problem.
Right.
And then you have to have confidence that if you can file and get to a court, if you know that that's where you should go, then you have to have confidence that once you're there, you're going to be treated fairly and your dispute will be resolved there. And I think one of the things we can do, I remember early in my career, I was a voluntary mediator in the small claims court, because a lot of, I think people who have, if you own a small business, if you have a dispute, domestic dispute, you know that maybe you should get a lawyer. But what do you do when you have these kind of small cases? You're not going to hire a lawyer for something like that, but being able to announce to people that you have the ability to go to small claims and there'll be a mediator and you can tell your side, I think is something that we should continue to do. And I know in New York, we have, for the law students, they have a pro bono responsibility requirement. So there are things that we're trying to do for that justice gap, but it's huge. And it feels like, we're putting the water in the bucket, but the bucket's got a hole in it. And so you can keep filling it, but it's not really being satisfied. But let me get to you, and then we'll come, yeah.
I guess I wanted to offer a hopeful perspective, which is that of not my generation, but the youth of our country. And I know them better than I know the youth of the world. But if you look at what's happening with the emerging generation of young people, which we call Gen Z.
Oh, and the
Let me
recording.
do this one. Let's see if this one goes. I don't want to.
It's for the recording.
You won't pick it up if you're not talking.
We're going to publish the, okay. There's some really hopeful signs among young people in this country in terms of their participation in civic life, despite the lack of civic education. We see it in a lot of different ways. Now, this is Gen Z, if you will, and millennials is the most diverse generation in history. And so issues of, that have divided Americans are much less divisive. Young people are used to, not caring about who you love, who you hang out with. They are participating and have a belief in surveys that we've done, and we've asked young people, do they believe that their generation can solve the problems? Overwhelming majorities, 85% of young people say that they believe that their generation, if they act together, can solve the problems that we face. When you look at their participation in political activity but not voting, so we surveyed young people and asked them if they had been to a march or a demonstration. We did this in, I think it was after the 2018 election. In 2014, 5% of young people said they'd been to a march or a demonstration. In 2016, it was 15%. In 2018, it was 27%. They are increasingly showing up at the ballot box and participating that way. They don't particularly care about candidates or parties, but they care about issues, including criminal justice reform, and certainly climate, things that affect them. But they're determined to work together with others to try to solve these. We saw the Parkland students, had that small group of high school students who organized following the shooting in their high school, went out and brought the issue of gun safety to young people across the country. And their message was, if you want to deal with this, vote. And they did. Now, they happen to be voting in increasingly partisan ways. That's not always been the case. Young people voted for Ronald Reagan in the 80s, but by huge margins, they're voting in a different direction now and electing more progressive people to Congress and the Senate and whatever. And so that's something that, I think, despite the fact that we haven't done a very good job at teaching them, they're out there learning, and more importantly, they're out there doing. One other point, which is that I think that the erosion of our civic life in this country, the lack of civility, the lack of collaboration, has been a multifaceted one. I mean, there have been a number of institutions that used to teach people how to work together and teach people about democracy, which I won't define, but church suppers, labor unions, newspapers where everybody at least read the same thing and could they may differ and they could debate, but they were dealing with the same facts. The military, when it wasn't all volunteer and people really experienced diversity for the first time in the services. I mean, income inequality, which is worse today than it has been since the Gilded Age in the 20s. All of these things, I think, have contributed to an erosion in our civic life and in our democracy. And so when we think about how to deal with it, although I think bringing civics back into the school, that's a problem doing nationally because our education system is so decentralized, and you have to do it state by state, and there is a great sensitivity about a national curriculum, but you do have to bring it to other places like the workplace and replace institutions through which we used to learn these things. I mean, even churches, people now go to mega churches, and so they don't do things in community as much. And they don't, just planning church suppers was a way that people learned to work together around a common purpose to get something done, which is what I think democracy is about.
Right, so we've talked about why we think it's important, why we know it's important to have civics education, and why we think civility is an aspect that's important. What are some solutions? Are we knocking our heads up against the wall and we're not going to make any progress? It sometimes feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm going to ask each of you, like, what's one thing, one trend, one idea that you think we could institute, big or small, that could help us move in the right direction? I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular. I'm going to ask you if anyone wants to go first. Otherwise, I will call on you.
I can start.
Good.
So I would say Law Day, which is May 1st, or Citizenships Day, to have a project-based event such as create a soapbox and give students an idea that they have to talk about. So you're giving them a sense of agency, and it could be something, let's say they want to use less water bottles in their school. They don't want school buses to idle outside. Something that directly impacts them. Or if they're in an underserved neighborhood and they don't have a green grocer, they can do something data-driven where they can look at how far away the green grocers are, where the bus routes go, how long does it take to get to the bus route. And then you're giving them this sense of how they can create change. With that information, they can approach their local legislature, because as we mentioned, we do have a federal structure, we have a state structure, and we also have a local structure. So it becomes very complicated, and giving students a sense of how they can influence policy in their particular neighborhood is something very important. And it's great to tie it into Law Day, because then you can also invite a judge to come and speak, or someone related to national security, or about arbitration, and you bring all of the threads together so they can really see how their work will be impactful. And that creates a sense of involvement in the public square, in a sense. Very much on the ground.
Well, I would suggest having people go to various events, because I understand. I grew up in small town America. I grew up in a very small town in Arkansas that there's been a decline in the populations. But what I remember and what I have found to be helpful, even in a larger area of where I live in the Portland metro area in Oregon, is when people have various events, to have people talking about registration drives. We do not need to wait to an election to make sure that people are registered to vote. And have a way for people to have an ability to check to see if they're actually registered, because often what happens is people think they're registered, and for whatever reason, because of various mechanisms, they may not be a voter who can actually vote in that upcoming election, and to give them information so that they can get registered properly so that they can participate in the process. I also think that we need to engage with people about why they feel they don't have a vote. I mean, I can remember having a conversation as I was traveling with someone who was frustrated with what she saw on the news and said, I'm not voting. And I was like, you need to vote because you, and we just had a conversation. Didn't tell her how to vote. She was actually serving me food. She came back at the end with the check and she says, I think I'm gonna vote. And I was like, look at that. It was 15 minutes of not even consistent conversation that made someone feel like I do have a right to vote. And I think voting is very important. Last thing I'll give as an example, when my daughter, who's now an adult, launched, fully formed, doing what she needs to do, they had a project in Oregon called the Bus Project, where they had students, their senior year of high school, registered to vote, and they could vote from out of state. But they had a permanent permanent address at home, and they would send it away. So I think we need to talk to people about how to actively participate in their form of government, is what I would suggest. Jim?
About 10 years ago, my theme for Law Day, National Law Day, was every vote counts. And that still is relevant today. And I'm glad we're now focusing on something positive. Our polling at the World Justice Project has shown something I really thought was remarkable. In household surveys, we found that Americans, whatever the age, more strongly support rule of law issues than in any of the other G7 countries. I was surprised by that. No person is above the law. The president ought to obey courts and the law. And this was true across the board, whatever the political party. And the numbers were really dramatic. So there's something to build on there that Deborah has identified here, if we can find the mechanics to do it. So there's a good base, frankly, a better base than I expected.
One of the reasons for that may be, and I can't think through the other 67 countries, but most of them probably were monarchies. This country was founded on the overthrow of the monarch. If I could do one thing, I'd get people to run for office.
Same. Me too.
Which is happening. But there's an inscription in the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, where I live, that says, this library is dedicated to the memory of John F. Kennedy and to all those who, through the art of politics, seek a new and better world, which is something I grew up with, but young people less today than then. But there is a lot of efforts and some really great small nonprofits that are trying to get young people to run for office. We now have a Gen Z representative in the Congress, Maxwell Frost from Florida, and you get people that look like other people, and they're going to show up. They're going to be inspired, and even though you can't get millions of people to run, if there are enough young people, think about the people that were inspired by John F. Kennedy when some of us were young, if we can remember back that far.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing I would do.
I agree, trying to get more people to be involved and engaged and run for office. But the flip side of that is, why would you want to run for office with the lack of civility, right? You get attacked. So we need to encourage them, but we need to also give them the tools that they need so that they can respond in ways that are productive and positive when the attacks come, because we know that the attacks will come, unfortunately. Bridget.
So I think we have to think like a lot bigger than we have been trained to think. And I follow all the research on Gen Z. I'm a big believer in Gen Z. I think we have to step aside and give the world to Gen Z. Like, give it to Gen Z. They have the right they have the right values, but that means I'm like at the very tip of Gen X.
Can we remind us, like Gen Z? I had this discussion before, because I know I'm firmly a baby boomer.
Yeah.
But Gen Z is the one below baby boomer, or below the next one? The next one.
Oh no.
It's Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, baby boomers.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So Gen Z would be in their 30s?
No, they're no.
Oh, okay. Well, 30 is young to me, so.
I think Gen Z right now ends around, of course it changes every year, 24, and then 24 to whatever, maybe 30 is millennials.
Okay.
That's right. And I'm sort of just at the very edge of Gen X, but my generation and baby boomers, we gotta like give them a seat at the table, let them start doing things. The other thing that gives me a lot of hope is generative AI. I think we might finally be on the verge of democratizing legal information and democratizing law, and amen to what that might bring. So Gen Z and generative AI are what gives me lots of hope right now. Bigger solutions, think bigger.
I like it. I think these are all great. Yeah, in 7th grade, I decided I was going to run for office. And I ultimately, which is why I went to law school, but I ultimately decided I couldn't take the attacks.
Yes.
So I never did run for office. Thank goodness, really. I think on the two key things on the content side of this that I think might be the most important to focus on. One is I think we are sadly not at a place where we can start a conversation with shared values. But I think we could start a conversation around shared aspirations. And I always say, and to the points that have been made about access to justice, if you asked a room full of people, and I envision at the workplace, in the lunchroom, right? How many people in this room think that government should treat everyone fairly, regardless of how much money or how much power you have? who's not going to raise their hand, except for that cranky person over there who just never raises their hand? But I mean, you're going to have a point that everyone agrees on as a starting point then for talking about how do we get there. And the second most important thing, I think, is reinvigorating this idea that the radical notion behind this country was self-government. And how incredibly radical that is. And take that enthusiasm of the Gen Z generation and really get them to envision by writing the Federalist Papers, right? That for the first time, you know, they were not going to be led by a king. The people were the sovereign power, because that's the basis for the sense of civic responsibility. And the civic responsibility gives the why for things like media literacy. Why should I care? You know, how do we make the stigma of spreading false information worse than the prestige of being the first to share, right? But those civic responsibilities in STEM. We're on a campaign to try to get some civics brought into STEM education, because
Put the C back in STEM.
right, exactly, STEM C.
What would, that's intriguing, what would that look like?
So, for example, talking about as an engineer, as an innovator, as a tech worker, the responsibility that you have, the impact starts with the impact of what you do on the broader world. And the responsibility that then comes with that, right? So you have to start by training the trainers. We're looking at making easy little modules and videos, et cetera. But the idea that you would get those students who might not otherwise have any interest in civics, but you tie it to where their passion is, and you try to do what you can to see that the next innovators of the next AI don't just put it out onto the marketplace without having first, and then tell us it's an existential threat.
There's a great debate going on right now. The really good AI people have said self-generative AI is not being produced to be self-testing. And so the reason why ChatGPT was pushed out so fast, but wasn't accurate, is it doesn't have the ability to ask itself, is the result I'm about to give you accurate? Does that case that I had you cite actually exist? And so I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and in my world of cybersecurity, right? Yeah, I mean, my day job is cybersecurity policies, and so, you know, not put out devices that are insecure, that you know are insecure, right? So that sense of civic responsibility that starts with understanding that we're serious when we say government of and by people.
Michele?
You know, when you talk about AI, you know, it's always, when you want to cherry pick, you talk about what's good about it, and then you realize, okay, but you forgot the other side. And one of the things I heard recently is that when they question some teenagers about their use of AI and the algorithms, and whether it should be regulated, that they cannot use algorithms based on the behavior of people that are 13 and younger. And when they asked this group of young people how would they feel about not being able to have an algorithm, they freaked out. Because they said, wait a minute, you mean I have to do the work? They're not going to point me in the right direction? You mean I have to Google something? And so there was actually resistance. It's surprising, because as much as they say that social platforms are making them more suicidal and less happy, when you ask something very pointedly, would you want this regulated so you don't have access to it, they were absolutely against it. That's just a footnote. So one of the things, when you talk about people should run for office, I want to be more pointed. They should run for school boards.
School board, yep.
Politics is local. And school boards are at the crux of what happens in communities. And it's so overlooked because it isn't valued, it's not high profile. And in that vein, if you can get to the younger people and show them how their voices make a difference and how they can resist negativity or be prepared for it, then I think you could really get people doing things that are going to change the arc of history. Because you got to start young. You can't start when they're 20. You've got to start when they're more formative.
And, yes.
Well, you know, taking into consideration my experience as an authority here, I think that if you go and speak to a crowd, sometimes it's not as effective as if you engage in a conversation. And I think that conversations around case studies that are of our concern, that have to do with strengthening our democracy, should be very effective. Like, I know that here they have offices that, they serve the community, and maybe the authorities can engage in these conversations with a diverse group talking about a case study. I think that's a good one.
So, are we supposed to finish at 4? Okay, so I have one more question, is for anyone. Is we focused a lot on civics, but civic education and kind of the, in students. What are some things that we can do for adults who need civic education? And now I know that the idea of maybe if you teach the students, they come home and then they talk to their parents about it, that certainly was something that I experienced when my son used to come home and talk about the environment and then really yell at us if we didn't recycle. And, it's like, okay, we got this little policeman around here making sure that we do it properly, but I appreciated it. So I know that that's one way. But as I say, there's a generation that grew up without civics education. Are there things that we can do? How do we reach them? I joked in the ABA and said we need to have like something on TikTok that goes viral that says why civics is important to me because, or demonstrate, you understand civics, or whatever it might be. But that's where a lot of people are, and that's where a lot of them get their information. So just trying to think of what can we do to reach adults. And I'm talking about the ones that want to be reached. We know that there are people that are in their echo chamber. They only listen to the news that they want to hear because it reinforces those perspectives. But there are people out there that really want to understand and really want to be educated. And so is there one, not maybe one way, but are there ways that we can reach that group?
Well, there are a number of bar associations. When I did a couple of presentations with our National Conference of Bar Presidents that have developed information that are about 90 seconds long. They have videos, they have different types of social media options to have people review while they're traveling on the bus or in transit, or they have 5 minutes and they want to look at something, and then it doesn't always have references to other information, and it is virtual. It is not a caricature or a cartoon, but it went off of from my generation, where in between the cartoons they had different vignettes about what is a bill, and then they taught people about conjunctions and things like that, and just that mindset of something that's 90 seconds, 2 minutes, that's good information that people can share, that they can kind of build upon, and it helps them either trigger in their memory or help them build a basis for education.
Well, I'm not on TikTok, but people send me stuff. No, seriously, like in some ways you can't avoid it because people send you. And the problem is it's like a rabbit hole because you get one and then as soon as it finishes, the next one. So this is the reason I know this, but there was one where there was a young woman, a lawyer, and she had a little baby. And she says, 5 things that I would tell you to protect your finances. And, 1, and she's got the baby here. And number 2, you can tell she's clearly a mom with this baby. It was such good information. So I think here's the challenge to all of us. Whether it is you or someone you know, I challenge you to get on TikTok and talk about 5 reasons civics matter. And, just make it clear. Did you know this? Did you know that? Did you know that? Because that's how we're going to meet people. Maybe that'll be the next grant, is like the TikTok grant. Well, maybe we won't have TikTok for long.
Did this systematically in Delaware to advertise the availability of long-acting reversible contraception. And we found, first we hired an advertising firm, and those ads fell flat. We then brought the kids together, the age group. So all I was going to do was suggest, money could be pulled together. A firm could be hired to organize age group focus groups. We'd have to decide some of the content we want to chat with them about and see what they come up with. What would they say? And then that's what you push on to TikTok and social media. That is, I think, how you go about it. And I think it would be a great project.
So if I just could, as part of our Civics at Work, we pulled together a multidisciplinary group to say, what are the key concepts you'd want to convey to adults?
Right.
In addition to how could you do it? And in part of that guide that we put together on Civics for Adults, we have links to resources and groups that are out there that already have a lot of materials. And I would love to add some of the things that I heard about today. So if you've got, programs that, get in touch with me, and would love to add those links so that they're available for folks. The Civic Renewal Network has been focused by the Annenberg Public Policy Center on developing and adapting materials for adults.
For adults.
And this fall, I think they're coming out with a big announcement.
So I think we've got our marching orders. We know we need to work towards to restore civics education, but then also not ignoring the fact that we need civics education for adults as well. So thank you all. I think it was a really good discussion. I appreciate it.